So the next study I'd like to discuss is the California Teachers Cohort, and I'd like to thank Bart Ostro for sharing his slides with me on this. It's a statewide cohort, very impressive size, 133,000 women that were part of the state teachers retirement system. It was established by Leslie Bernstein and others and Peggy Reynolds to look at breast cancer risk factors, but it's been used for many other health outcomes. There's annual recontact since 1995. There's follow-up to 2005, and there's linkage to hospitalization as well as mortality through statistical databases. There's a monthly residential history. That's a great strength of this, so we can see when the people are moving and whether that has an impact on their exposure. There's low active smoking prevalence, highly educated group of women, only 5% at baseline. It's an aging cohort that is experiencing some mortality. And there's little likelihood of significant occupational exposures or socioeconomic differences because they're all teachers. The authors examined all-cause cardiopulmonary ischemic heart disease and pulmonary mortality. And they were particularly interested in this initial study looking at different species of particles. And we've heard some criticism that we shouldn't just look at particles in their aggregate. So they took 8 counties where there was speciated data, so data on different types of particulate matter available, and they measured the PM mass, but also elemental carbon, organic carbon, sulfates, nitrates, and a variety of other elements that Dr. Ostro had found in time series studies were associated with mortality. Next, please. So the monthly residential histories were geocoded, and they summed up the long-term exposure by their person months at the pollution site. So they had monthly estimates of pollution. And then they looked at 2 sizes of rings or buffers around the monitoring sites, 8 kilometers and 30 kilometers. And these were designed to simulate the Harvard 6 City study, the smaller rings, or the ACS study to show the average metropolitan area size. Covers a wide swath of California and a wide variety of exposures. In Los Angeles, this is what it would look like. There's the inner ring in the central area of the city, and the larger buffer would cover most of the Los Angeles County. So all of the models were fit with the same type of modeling structure we've been using in all of our studies, cost proportional hazards. So we're looking at time to failure, or how long someone survives compared to others at the same time, and comparing their pollution levels. And what we have included here is basically the same grouping of variables, plus some that are particular to women to control for confounding. Next, please. The study, I'll show you the results. The slide seems to have been omitted. I'm not sure if it didn't come up, but there's a summary slide. Suffice to say, they found very large risks in the range of 1.8 hazard ratio for the teachers cohort for all-cause mortality, and going up to about 2.8 for ischemic heart disease. So much larger risks than what we've observed in other studies, and perhaps we can discuss some of the reasons for that later. Let me go on, though, to the Aventis study, and I'll focus on the Chen paper, the most recent work. And this study had a smaller sample, but it was non-smoking, non-Hispanic Seventh-day Adventists, so people that would not have the major confounder for smoking in their lifestyles. They had to have lived in the same location for 10 years or longer within 5 miles of their residence at the time of enrollment. Most came from San Francisco, the South Coast, and the San Diego air basins, but there's a 13% statewide random sample. Next. And PM2.5 in this study was imputed because it wasn't available historically from 11 airsheds based on the visibility that was available at airports. So there's a long history of trying to impute air pollution exposures from other indicators. The authors were able to show fairly convincingly they could replicate PM2.5 values in later time periods by using airport data. By the time they had followed up to 1998, they had something like 3,200 subjects available. So it's a much smaller study, but because it's in non-smokers, I think it's an important study. And they had the vital status for coronary heart disease assessed by the death certificate and verified by social contacts in the family. They included roughly the same list of confounders minus the smoking variables that we might have seen in the other studies. Next. And what we see is, for women, a significantly elevated risk of about 40%. So the hazard ratio is a 40% increase, significantly elevated, and a negative hazard ratio for males that's statistically insignificant. Next, please. Now, sometimes you need a picture to tell many words, and I think this picture summarizes things quite nicely. I have the national level American Cancer Society study, the risk estimates that are in the so-called Krusky report. So this shows them for all causes: cardiovascular disease, ischemic heart disease. This is from my Los Angeles study. Bigger error bars because we have a smaller sample, but comparable risk estimates. This is the California-wide study. They're slightly smaller overall than what we're seeing in some of the other studies, but significantly elevated for cardiovascular, ischemic heart disease, and cardiopulmonary, not shown here, and all causes minus cancer. The Aventis study, we see this large increase for women, but not for men. And then the California teacher study, we see a very large increase, nearly tripling of ischemic heart disease deaths and near a doubling of deaths for all causes. So if we go back and we think about what leading epidemiologists like Rothman will say, don't worry about single studies, don't worry about particular confidence intervals, look at the pattern in the risks. And the pattern we see here is that for every California-wide study, there's a significantly elevated risk of dying in relation to air pollution. So the California-specific studies show associations between mortality and PM2.5 that are quite consistent. There's some heterogeneity in the size of the effects, the groups affected, and the causes of death associated with PM2.5, and that's why we need to continue to study this problem to better understand how we can improve public health. And finally, I would say the overall California studies are very consistent with the broader body of evidence presented by Dr. Cohen, indicating that there are associations between PM2.5 and mortality. So it's, I think, comforting to see these California-specific studies are producing results that are very similar to what we see in the broader body of literature. But I think when we're looking at dose response, we would never want to rely on a small group of studies. We want to rely on the other studies that have applicability here, the national level studies, some of the studies that are coming out of other countries as well. I'd like to acknowledge my funders, the Air Resources Board, the Health Effects Institute, and the National Institute of Environmental Health Science. I'd like to thank you for your time today.